But Strawberry the horse shook his head, gave a cheerful whinny, and seemed to feel better. Strawberry did the most natural thing in the world. Being very thirsty, he walked slowly across to the nearest pool and stepped into it to have a drink. Diggory was still holding the witch's heel, and Polly was holding Diggory's hand. One of the cabbies' hands was on Strawberry, and Uncle Andrew, still very shaky, had grabbed the cabbie's other hand. "Quick! Greens!" Oughtn't we to be nearly there now? We do seem to be somewhere. At least I'm standing on something solid. Why, so am I, now I come to think of it. But why is it so dark? Do you think we got into the wrong pool? Perhaps this is Charn, only we've got back in the middle of the night. This is not Charn. This is an empty world. This is nothing.
You can see part 6 of this thrilling tale on BBC Two in 3 weeks' time. That's Tuesday, the 11th of November. This is BBC Two, continuing a journey down the Nile.
The Nile is the longest river in the world, more than 6,000 kilometers in length. On its journey through North Africa, it crosses 9 countries, flowing through spectacular changes of landscape. Along its length, it supports life for plants, animals, and millions of people. As it travels north, it becomes a wide, sweeping river, but it starts its journey small, in the mountains of Ethiopia and Uganda. North Africa doesn't have 4 distinct seasons like those of Europe. It has 2, wet and dry. Now it's the dry season. There's no rain and it's hot. The temperature can go up to 58 degrees centigrade. Along the length of the Nile, the water level is low. The high temperature causes a huge quantity of water to evaporate. In many places, the riverbed has dried out, leaving something more like a stream than a river. But a few months from now, this riverbed will be filled with water. The question is, where does it come from? It's the dry season here, in the Ethiopian highlands. This is where one branch of the Nile begins its journey. It hasn't rained for months. The earth is parched, and little is growing. But this is about to change. Above the mountains, clouds are appearing. Weather systems crossing North Africa bring these clouds of water vapor to the Ethiopian highlands. They're made of tiny droplets hanging in the air. When they come into contact with the mountains, the vapor turns back to water and it rains. The rainy season in these highlands can last for several months. The farmers depend on the rain. It's the only supply of water they have for their crops and animals. A good rainy season makes the Ethiopian highlands a rich and fertile place. The rain makes the crops grow, so there's food for the animals, and the farmers can produce enough to feed themselves and their families, plus perhaps a little more to sell. The problem for the farmers here is that the rains don't always come. When they don't, the dry season continues. There's a drought. Ethiopia suffers terrible droughts at times, so it's not surprising the arrival of the rains is a reason to celebrate in these highlands. The rains soak the hillsides here until the earth can't absorb any more water, so it collects on the surface and then begins to trickle away downhill. As these rivulets of water meet up, they become streams. The streams flow on downhill, joining up to become rivers. The rivers that flow out of the Ethiopian highlands carry something with them: fertile topsoil. At night, the highlands are very cold. The water on the surface of the ground freezes. As it turns into ice, it expands, breaking up the earth. When the sun comes up in the morning, the ice melts and the earth is left crumbly and fine. Everywhere on these hillsides, loose soil sits, just waiting for a passing flow of water to scoop it up. The rivers carry tons of rich, fertile soil out of the Ethiopian highlands. This is not good for farming. The water is stripping away the fertile land on the hillsides. The highland rivers and streams all flow into the same place: Lake Tana. The lake is a natural reservoir. It collects the water from the highlands. Many thousands of people live on its shores. They farm the land around it. They fish from it, tons of fish every year. And as well as this, they guide visitors to the lake's magnificent sights. The rich variety of birds that live around Lake Tana make the lake popular with bird watchers. As the rains continue, the water level in Lake Tana rises. In the dry season, just a trickle of water flows over these falls out of the lake. But the deep hollows carved in the rock show the water must have far more power at other times. After the rains, these falls show a very different face. These spectacular falls are a major tourist attraction in Ethiopia. The water drops 46 meters, straight down. The mist thrown from the cascading water soaks the countryside around. It gives the falls their name, Tis Isat, smoking fire. The falls have another name, the Blue Nile Falls. More than 60 mountain rivers flow into Lake Tana, but just one flows out, the Blue Nile. Though it's called blue, the river here is far from blue, because it's carrying millions of tons of soil. As the river flows north, crossing Ethiopia, it travels through a steep-sided gorge. The Blue Nile Gorge is more than 600 kilometers long, and at some points it's more than 1,000 meters deep and 20 kilometers wide. This deep gash has been carved out of the rock over millions of years by the waters of the Blue Nile as they thunder downhill. Still today, the power of the water is eroding and changing this landscape. Downstream, the dry riverbeds will soon be filled with water. In the wet season, as the Blue Nile flows out of Ethiopia and into Sudan, thousands of litres of water are passing along the river every minute. The landscape the river crosses in Sudan is quite different. Here it flows across flat plains. People farm along its banks, but the danger is that at its peak, the river can flood this flat land, which can be disastrous for those who live here. In Sudan, the Blue Nile meets up with the other branch of the Nile, the White Nile. The two rivers join in what Arab poetry calls the longest kiss in history. They really are different colours, because they've scooped up different types of rock and earth on their journeys. The White Nile is wider than the Blue Nile. It's travelled further to get to this meeting point, from the hills of Uganda. On its way through southern Sudan, the river crosses one of the largest swamps in the world, the Sud. Here the White Nile bursts its banks and floods a vast area of land. But in just a few weeks, the land emerges again as the water evaporates in the sun and is soaked up by this swampland. The White Nile loses much of its water in the Sud. The Blue and White Niles flow side by side, keeping their own colour, until their waters merge at Khartoum to make one river, the Nile. Khartoum is an important city. It's the capital of Sudan, a busy port, a centre for trade, and home to over 1 million people. It's been called the crossroads of Africa, because by river, rail and road, goods and people from all over the continent pass through here. After Khartoum, the Nile flows north through a desert that people call the Belly of Stones. The narrow green strip by the river is the only land that supports life in this part of the immense desert that covers North Africa, the Sahara. Here the river passes through the land of the Black Pharaohs. These tombs are all that's left of a great civilization. More than 2,000 years ago, this was the Nubian kingdom of Kush. The kings that ruled here had great power. They were strong enough at one time to conquer their northern neighbours and rule ancient Egypt. The Nile flows north out of Sudan and into Egypt. This is the Nile Valley. It's a long, narrow strip of fertile land that cuts through the Sahara Desert. There's almost no rain here, so people depend on the river for water. Farming is Egypt's biggest industry. Millions of tons of crops grown in these fields are exported around the world. And the river is also the centre for another industry: tourism. Luxury cruisers travel the Nile carrying visitors to Egypt's great monuments. Thousands of tourists visit sites on the banks of the Nile every year, making the tourist trade Egypt's second biggest industry. The Nile is the center of life in Egypt today, as much as it was 5,000 years ago. In Egypt, the Nile ends its journey as it divides into smaller rivers and crosses the delta to the Mediterranean Sea. It has traveled thousands of kilometers through 9 countries and influenced the lives of millions on its way. It's lived up to its reputation as the river of life.
From Durham to Delhi, Wrexham to Rajasthan, why not bring the world into your classroom with BBC World Class? You can put your school on the map and find out everything you need to know to get your school twinned with a school overseas at bbc.co.uk/worldclass.
From big business to personal finance, all the news you need on Working Lunch in half an hour. And now at midday on BBC Two, the Daily Politics with Andrew Neil and Anita Anand.
Afternoon, folks. Welcome to the Daily Politics. One day on from the government's banking bailout, the Cabinet gathers in Downing Street to discuss what next. As the markets continue to pick up and the dust settles, we'll look at just how much taxpayers' money the Prime Minister has laid on the line.
The latest news from the real economy isn't so cheering. Inflation is up. It's now running at 5.2%. We'll ask what that means for householders across the country.
The Home Secretary drops plans to hold terror suspects for up to 42 days without charge. What happened to the government's insistence that these changes were vital for the national security?
And look out, Gordon. There's a new generation vying for your job. We're going to hear from 2 young stars of a new TV series who've been in the firing line from a rather familiar face.
Your campaign's over. Your campaign's over. You weren't very hot on the facts. Your campaign's over.
My campaign's been over for years. All that in the next 30 minutes. With us for the duration, the style and design critic. Some may say guru. But I wouldn't, because I know what it means. Stephen Bailey, welcome. Good to have you back.
It's great to be here.
It's very relaxed for a financial crisis. Let's kick off with the dramatic defeat of the government's 42 days terror legislation in the House of Lords last night. The Home Secretary says the proposals have now been dropped, though she did produce a new draft bill which will be held in reserve, maybe wheeled out in the aftermath of any future terror attack. Last night, Ms Smith insisted that the change is still needed